Tangi hoki ko o. Tana tatu katoa. Ko hinai toku maunga. Ko Potomac rawa ko horano. O kuawa. Ko hurai roa ko dine o kuiwi. I tai mai aho ki Aotearoa I te taurua mano te ko maiwa. Ko Barbara Kurzer, ko Elliot Cohen, ko Hazel Bradford, rato ko Roy Clancy o ku komatua. Ko Paula Cohen, rawa ko David Clancy o ku matua. I tipu ake o ki Gaithersburg, Maryland, me Houston, Texas hoki. E noho ano o ki nainai. Ki ngatini mate o rato o te mo mahara, uru patu o te kota hitanga o ngā whenua o te ao kua whetu rangitia moe mai rā. E mihi ana ki a koto te mana whenua, nā koto I whakatuwhera I tene ahi ahi. Kia ora ki a tato kua hui hui mai e tene ahi ahi. Ko Kristopher Clancy toku ingoa, no reira, tana koto, tana koto, tana koto katoa. Uchim habayim ve'er tov, good evening and welcome. Tonight we come together to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. A special welcome to Consul General Sarah Nelson of the United States, Their Excellencies, the members of the Diplomatic Corps, to the Mayor of Hamilton, Paula Southgate, and Hamilton City Councilors Mark Donovan and Maxine von Oosten, to Rachel O'Connor, Lead Advisor to Race Relations Commissioner, to Axel Beck, Deputy Mayor, Waikato District Council, to Ethan Jerome-Leota, Representative of the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, to faith leaders and those engaged in interfaith activities, to our honored and cherished Holocaust survivors, and to all other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and mokopuna. Today, 77 years ago, the Soviet Army liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, the most notorious of all of the death camps created by the Nazis and their collaborators. During its operation, an estimated 1.3 million people were murdered at the complex. In all, over 11 million people would be killed at the hands of the Nazis, with over 6 million of those being Jews. The Nazi desire to completely eradicate the Jewish people from Europe led to the development of the most heinous crimes that humanity has ever known. It is for this reason that we come together, to commemorate and honor all the lives of those people that were tragically cut short by hate and intolerance. Designated by the United Nations in 2005, this commemoration honors the lives of Jews, the Roma and Sinti people, more commonly known as Gypsies, homosexuals, the physically and mentally handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others targeted because of their ethnicity or political views. Remembering the Holocaust is universally acknowledged as a way of reminding ourselves of what horrors human beings are capable of perpetrating. Too often, the narrative of the Holocaust is a focus on the inevitability of the events of the Holocaust, forgetting that these events included everyday people who had to make life and death decisions. Each of these decisions, each day that saw another sunrise and sunset, was an act of resistance against the death machine of the Nazis. Whether it was secretly teaching your children Hebrew, prayers in the dark, practicing medicine while confined in the ghetto, or living one more day in the darkest depths of hell created by man, all of these were resistance. While World War II may have ended 77 years ago, resistance against the ideology of the Nazis has not ended. With Holocaust distortion and denial rampant, and the rise of antisemitism in the public sphere and online, the act of resistance continues. Yisker, the opening word to memorial prayers, means may he remember. We say memorial prayers at different times of the year, be it during our holy festivals, such as Yom Kippur or Pesach, yet we also say it weekly at Shabbat services, allowing the individual mourners the chance to speak the names of their departed, their names added to the lists of martyrs and holy people who have guided us for centuries. Please stand for the recitation of Yisker by Sami Cohen. Sami is a resident of Hamilton since 1970, having immigrated to New Zealand from Israel. He is a second-generation survivor, both of his parents having survived the Holocaust. His father lost his entire family, including his parents and 7 siblings. His mother and 1 sister were the only survivors from her family.
יזכור אלוהים את נשמות אחינו בני ישראל, חללי השואה וגיבוריה, נשמות 600 רבבות אלפי ישראל שהומתו ושנהרגו ושנחנקו ונקברו חיים, ואת קהילות הקודש שנחרבו על קדושת השם. יזכור אלוהים את עקדתם עם עקדת שאר קדושי ישראל וגיבוריו מימי עולם, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. הנאהבים והנעימים בחייהם ובמותם לא נפרדו, ינוחו בשלום עם משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
אמן.
On the annual anniversary of the death of a loved one in the Hebrew calendar, Jews light what is known as Ner Neshama, or soul candle, or in Yiddish, a Yahrzeit candle. This candle is typically lit at home by family members in memory of the deceased. Growing up, I remember being told by my mother that the candle is a way for the deceased to come and visit us, a way to reconnect and speak with your departed loved ones. When the candle would go out, she would say, "See you next year, Mom." As we light these candles tonight, we are inviting those who have departed us to visit and to know that they are still remembered, that their lives had meaning, and in their deaths, we have learned the lessons to repudiate hate. I would like to invite Wotem, a year 6 student at Aotearoa Primary School, to help me in lighting the candles. We light a candle to honor the Jewish men, women, and children whose lives were taken from them by antisemitism and apathy. We light a candle to honor the Roma and Sinti murdered by hatred and racism. We light a candle to honor the mentally and physically disabled people that were murdered in the name of science and the perfect race. We light a candle for the unknown numbers of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people targeted for daring to exist. We light a candle for those who spoke out and rose up against the Nazis, fighting back against the tide of fascism that seemed like an inevitable tidal wave. We light a candle for those persecuted for their religious beliefs, for refusing to bow down at the altar of intolerance and destruction, for the unknown victim who dared to speak out and speak the truth. The New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO has been partnering with the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand in Wellington since 2008, and now in 5 different cities around Aotearoa New Zealand. Please welcome Ethan Jerome-Leota, the Waikato UNESCO Youth Representative, with a message from the UNESCO Director General.
On the 27th of January 1945, the Soviet forces entered the Nazi concentration and extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Today, we remember that terrible, dark period of history which saw 6 million Jews murdered and which has continued to haunt the survivors and their families. And we commemorate it unwaveringly so that it can never be repeated. This work of memory has never been as relevant as it is now, not only because the pandemic has brought back the dark and sinister reflex of scapegoating, but also because indecent and absurd comparisons drawn between the measures taken to fight the pandemic and the measures taken by the Nazis to persecute the Jews end up by downplaying the tragedy of the Holocaust. Whenever this history is questioned, whenever violence is done to the memory of the victims, the rise of anti-Semitism and hate speech is encouraged. An everyday scourge of Jewish communities around the world. More than ever, we must therefore be vigilant. It is our shared responsibility to protect the truth and to keep alive the memory of all those who have suffered under the Nazi regime, to support research and documentation that can confront the fantasies of the fanatics with the reality of history, and to study and teach the Holocaust, so that education may prevent anti-Semitism and all forms of racism. So it is through our collective efforts, constantly renewed, and that we will all be able to raise the memory of this painful past in the minds of men and women, especially the new generations, as a bulwark against hate speech and extremist ideologies as a defence of peace. That is UNESCO's undertaking. That is why, on this International Day, I call on all our member states to continue their efforts alongside us to support research and education and to raise awareness of the horror of the Holocaust, to honour the dead and to protect the living. Thank you.
Please welcome Her Worship, the Mayor of Hamilton, Paula Southgate.
Ka te rā te aroha ki te iwi kua nau. Koutou kua whetirangi ki te kahu o te pō. Mā muri nei te whakaaro. Mā muri mei nei e kōrero. Kua titinga ki te nākau tangata e kapi nei i te whenua. And a translation. I'm consumed with sorrow and love for those who are no longer with us here today. Those who adorn the night skies and shining stars for us all to see and remember. Our thoughts, our stories are etched in the cornerstones of our hearts. Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome, first of all, to the Waikato Museum and to Kirikiriroa Hamilton. I'm particularly humbled and honoured to be here today because I know it's the first time that this event has been officially commemorated in Hamilton Kirikiriroa, although we have had smaller commemorations in the past. I know there have been commemorations in Wellington since 2007, Auckland since 2013, and Christchurch. So I'm really, really pleased that Hamilton is now part of national commemoration events so that our city too can formally acknowledge and bear witness to the horrific events that occurred between 1933 and 1945 and the ongoing impact of those. May I begin by formally welcoming US Consul General Sarah Nelson to Hamilton. I understand this is one of your first official outings here since being in your role, and we hope we can welcome you here some more. Welcome, because this is one of New Zealand's best cities. In fact, we were voted New Zealand's best large city not that long ago. My warmest welcome to the Human Rights Commission, and please pass on my regards to Meng, who's a personal friend. Thank you for the important work that the Race Relations Commissioner does make to make New Zealand a better place. Thank you also to Moshe, Malal and Kristopher Clancy from the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand for their work in making today happen. We really appreciate it. It has now been, as you've heard, 77 years since the end of World War II. The work of the Holocaust Centre and other organisations like it is more important than ever. That in itself is a tragedy. The Holocaust Centre inspires and empowers action against antisemitism and discrimination. Importantly, it also fights one of our greatest foes, apathy, by remembering, by educating, by ensuring we can all bear witness to the Holocaust and learn those lessons. And that is what we're here doing today. I doubt anyone needs a reminder of what the Holocaust was, the genocide of 6 million Jews carried out by Nazi Germany and its allies between 1933 and 1945. While the survivors of the Holocaust are now dwindling and direct witnesses of Nazi atrocities are dying, the work of the Holocaust Centre and organisations is not waning, and thank goodness for that. It is a tragedy that in Europe and the United States in particular, there appears to be a resurgence of anti-Semitism alongside the ideology of white supremacism. It's white supremacy. So decades after 1945, this work becomes more important. And let's not kid ourselves. We know, and I certainly know from first-hand experience, that hate speech and discrimination does, sadly, exist here in Kirikiriroa as elsewhere. That is why the very notion of resistance, which the Holocaust Centre promotes, of resisting and pushing back on those kind of beliefs and behaviours and ideologies is so important. I just want to take a bit of time today, though, by talking about what does that mean for Hamilton. We are a city that is home to over 160 different ethnicities and nationalities, different races, different creeds, and different religions. We are also at the very heart of kingitanga, and our partnership with Māori is one of the greatest strengths that we have as a city. More and more, Hamilton is a beautiful cultural mix, and each race and group, in my belief, add and enhance to the flavour, to the wonderful colour and richness of the whole. It's a wonderful thing. In New Zealand terms, our city has had some dark patches in history, and it's important to remember that. And as your speech mentioned before, right now with what's going on in COVID, we're seeing the resurgence of hateful speech that is misdirected and inappropriate. As a city leader, I have instigated and led, and at times therefore, as you do when you are in this position, borne the brunt of conversations about race, culture, history and citizenship. Because it is important that we learn from the past and value all lives and move to a place where we can truly value each other as equals. I have resisted the option to say nothing, to do nothing. It possibly would have been easier when you think about certain statues and other issues of those types. But if we're not here to do right, why are we here at all? In a culturally diverse and rich city like Hamilton, there is no place for racial division. I want a city that embraces diversity and enriches the lives of all our citizens. The differences should not unite us, but they should divide us. Like others, I've been chastised, castigated, and even threatened for saying things which make people feel a little uncomfortable. In those times, I take some solace from good friends like Meng Foon, and I've spoken to him at length about that. But what is more important is that people in our city are calling out that behaviour and embracing topics that I believe the majority want to be heard, and they want strong, positive change. I've been heartened by that response to courageous conversations that go to the very heart of what it means to live in a fair and just community. But I acknowledge that we're only at the very beginning of these. That is why today is so important, 77 years later. Remembering the Holocaust is important for all of us. It is the work of the organisations such as the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand that make it easier for us to call out hateful speech and hateful attitudes and forms of discrimination. The reality is that the human race is always good at seeing what is right here in front of us, but we can take a bit longer to digest and to understand, albeit abhorrent acts that are happening far away from us. Easier to put them out of reach, out of sight, out of mind, if you like. In researching this speech, I read again about a report from a BBC reporter, Richard Dimbley. Dimbley was the first broadcaster to enter the Bergen-Belsen death camp after it was liberated on April 15th, 1945. I will add, I have never been there, but I have been, my husband has, and I have been to Dachau. Dimbley broke down several times during his report, and initially his managers back in London refused to play that report because it was far too emotive. And they simply could not comprehend or believe the scenes that he was describing and relaying. But he threatened to resign unless that report was broadcast. And so 2 days later, albeit a very heavily edited version of the report went out, and the truth and the scale began to be known. For the first time, the British public heard from a trusted source of what had occurred at Belsen. And so the discussion of the Holocaust began. Decades later, as I said before, it's both a tragedy and a triumph that the discussion is still continuing. Right here in this museum today, I'll just make a note that there was an exhibition about the Springbok tour and the protests around that. And of course, that is relevant. We must continue to fight at every turn against the despicable ideology and hatred that led to a systemic and planned and meticulously planned out meticulously mapped plan to exterminate Jews and all of those other people for their points of difference. And we must continue to do the same with racism in this city. And in fact, wherever we see it, we must call it out. Work to ensure it is never considered even remotely acceptable, not today, not ever. But it is a triumph that despite ongoing challenges, despite the refusal of the minority to accept that their ideologies can be fundamentally wrong, that most people do. I'm a bit of an optimist, I have to say. I sincerely believe most of us want to do what is right. Holocaust Remembrance Day reminds us again why this is so important. So this is why I welcome this event in the city. I hope it becomes an annual occasion from which we can draw lessons on. And I hope that in future occasions I will be able to stand here and talk about the progress that Hamilton City Council has made in terms of some of its courageous conversations. And I just want to give a big shout out to an ex-mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landra, who shared with me his experiences with the colonial statues in New Orleans and the terrible time he suffered for 2 years to achieve that result. Hamilton's got work to do. So I want to just finish by saying, Mia Zainendo. We are still here. Ngā mihi no iwi kia koutou katoa.
Please welcome Consul General Sarah Nelson of the Consul General of the United States.
Good afternoon. Kia ora. Distinguished guests, including Mayor Paula Southgate, Waikato Museum Director Liz Cotton, thank you, the lead advisor for the Race Relations Commission, Commissioner Rachel O'Connor, the Holocaust Center for New Zealand's representative Moshi Meng, survivors, family of survivors, distinguished guests, thank you all so much for inviting me here today. It's an honor to represent the U.S. Consulate, the ambassador to New Zealand, the U.S. mission in New Zealand and Samoa, to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year, the commemoration event is focused on the theme of resistance. In the United States, every January, we honor an individual who resisted the status quo and fought for freedom, justice, human rights in our country. That would be the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Our lives begin to end the day we begin." I'm going to start that again. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. We know that millions of Jews, as well as the Roma, Sinti, Slavs, disabled persons, LGBTQ+ individuals, and many others were among those murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Unfortunately, I can't think of no other international event that is surrounded by so much distortion and denial. When our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, gave his first public remarks, he shared his personal experience as a stepson of a Holocaust survivor and emphasized that Holocaust issues remain high on his agenda. It's no accident that people who seek to create instability and undermine democracy often try to cast doubt on the Holocaust. He said on the commemoration of last year's International Remembrance Day. That's why it's so important that we speak the truth about the past, to protect the facts when others try to distort or trivialize Holocaust crimes. It's important to seek justice for the survivors and their families. Sadly, Holocaust distortion, which excuses, minimizes, or misrepresents the known historical record of the Holocaust, is becoming increasingly widespread today. This distortion is often left unchecked and is a dangerous first step towards more radical forms of antisemitism, conspiracy theories, and anti-democratic behavior. When left unchecked, we minimize the individuals and the families that were horrifically impacted. These people that are not just numbers or statistics, but we're living, breathing, feeling human beings. It's our moral obligation to work together to expose the lies and spread the truth. We know that Holocaust distortion harms our democracies, normalizes anti-Semitism, and fuels extremism. In the United States, we are taking action towards resisting these distortions. For example, the new US-Germany dialogue on Holocaust issues is coordinating action to counter instances of disinformation. The Secretary of State has also announced a new quarterly series of exchange programs on Holocaust distortion and denial, now in development with the Department of State. On this day last year, President Biden said, "When hatred goes unchecked, and when the checks and balances in government and society that protect fundamental freedoms are lost, violence and mass atrocities can result." The United States will continue to champion justice for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. We are committed to helping build a world in which the lessons of the Holocaust are taught and in which all human lives are valued. Now, thinking back on those words by Martin Luther King Jr., our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. We very proudly and loudly proclaim today that remembering the Holocaust matters, truth matters, and resisting false narratives is our duty to uphold. For those of us in the United States government, our resistance is countering Holocaust distortion and denial. I thank you very much for inviting me here today to share just my few thoughts on this. Kerekoto, terekoto, teretato, kato. Thank you so much.
Please welcome Rachel O'Connor, Lead Advisor to Race Relations Commissioner Meng Foon.
Waikato Council. It's my absolute privilege to be here today, particularly as a Hamiltonian, where most of my family are based here, but I'm currently living in Wellington, and I was meant to be accompanying Meng Foon here today, but unfortunately he's not well, so I'll pass some kind messages as well. But I was delighted to be able to continue to come to the Hamilton event, feeling very strongly about this work and this community. So, it's a real honour to be here to stand alongside you and to commemorate this day. We particularly want to honour the Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the other victims of the Iraq as well, and it feels so important to be here today to do that for all of you in this room. I want to acknowledge particularly the Jewish community here today. We total for your leadership in ensuring that you create this space for us and your community, to the wider community, to come together to remember this. For us to come together, it means that we continue to recommit every year to never again. And so we total for you for the work that you do to make this happen so that we can be part of that journey alongside you. We also want to recognise the very real impact that anti-Semitism has on your lives, both what we see occurring internationally but as well domestically. And I hope that today is also an opportunity for you to see those of us who are joining with you today to acknowledge that we continue to stand with you in those moments, and we'll continue to find ways to address and to resist against that. Over the past 2 years, there has been so much talk about people's rights in a way that often hasn't been a normal conversation in the past. And certainly at the Human Rights Commission, we have struggled and engaged in many of these conversations about what rights mean and what does it mean about individual and collective rights and what rights people have and that sort of side of things. Today, reflecting on why we're here, I've been reflecting a lot on the right to life and liberty and the right to live that life without discrimination. The horrific consequences that we are acknowledging today by being here is very much what occurs when those rights are violated, those basic rights to life and liberty. And so I hope that the remembrance today continues to bring us together in a way that we can continue to fight and resist and spur on both individual and collective action to ensure that this never happens. We know in the Human Rights Commission we talk a lot around giving nothing to racism, because we know it's those everyday instances that we have to continue to address, that hold apathy at bay, that fights against discrimination, that fights against racism. And so today we commit again as Human Rights Commission to standing with you and to continuing to do the work alongside you to fight those things. So kia ora, thank you for the invitation to be here today.
Please welcome Jessica King as she reads about Holocaust resistor Jorgen Knudsen. Jessica is a Jewish Polish-American who is honored and fortunate to be the granddaughter of 4 grandparents who all survived the Holocaust. Her father's parents survived being sent to concentration camps, while her mother's parents survived in hiding. Her grandfather, Isidor Feumann, documented his story of survival in The Pit and Trap by Liev Roshman.
In October 1943, Jorgen Knudsen was a medical student at Bisping Hospital in Copenhagen, Denmark, when the order for the arrest and deportation of Denmark's Jews came down. The roundup of Danish Jews was to begin on September 29, 1943, the first night of Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. This order leaked to the Jewish community from German diplomat George Ferdinand Duckwitz, allowed for the Danish resistance movement to organize the rescue of over 99% of the Jewish community. It was in this setting that Jorgen decided to resist the Nazis and their orders. Together with almost the entire staff of the hospital, they hid over 1,000 Jews, disguising them as patients and then secreting them out in the night through personal vehicles, ambulances, hearses, to the boats that would take them to safety in Sweden. The Danish resistance to the Nazis went further still, as many Danes protected the homes and businesses of those Jews that escaped, protecting their goods and giving them back to the neighbors who returned at the end of the war. When Jorgen was caught and arrested for helping the Jews escape, he was beaten by the Nazi officials and the Danish collaborators. He openly admitted to helping Jews escape and being friends with Jews. And when he was questioned later in life on why he helped resist the Nazi orders and rescue the Jews, this was his response. It was never a question of Jew or non-Jew. It was a question of people in distress. I would have helped anyone to escape from the Gestapo. His sentiment, so succinctly put, is encapsulated in the Mali Fakutoki. Heaha teme nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? The people, the people, the people. Thank you.
Please welcome Noga Malal as she reads the poem Resistance Is by Chaim Guli and Monia Avachami. Noga is a Year 13 student at Rototuna High School and has been in New Zealand for 9 years. Originally from Israel, Noga proudly views herself as Jewish, Israeli, and Kiwi.
Resistance is. To smuggle a loaf of bread was to resist. To gather information and distribute an underground newsletter was to resist. To cry out warnings and shatter illusions was to resist. To rescue a tourist gold was to resist. To forge documents was to resist. To smuggle people across borders was to resist. To chronicle events and conceal the records was to resist. To extend a helping hand to those in need was to resist. To dare speak out at the risk of one's life was to resist. To stand empty-handed against the killers was to resist. To reach the besieged, smuggling weapons and commands was to resist. To take up arms in streets, mountains, and forests was to resist. To rebel in the death camps was to resist. To raise up in ghettos amid tumbling walls in the most desperate revolt humanity has ever known.
Sophie Scholl was a German university student and a revolutionary activist. When she moved to Munich in 1942 to attend university, she encountered the Weiße Rose, a non-violent resistance group in Nazi Germany. What Sophie came to learn was that her brother, Hans Scholl, was one of the founding members of the Weiße Rose along with Alexander Schmorrell, Christoph Profs, and Billy Graf. Active from June 1942 until their capture in February 1943, the Weisse Rosa distributed leaflets around Munich and the university, calling on non-violent resistance and protest against Hitler and the Nazi regime. Sophie, along with her brother Hans and Christoph Profs, were convicted of high treason after having been found distributing the anti-war leaflets at the university in February 1943. As a result, they were executed by guillotine. Sophie was 21 years of age at the time of her death. Her last words were a call to action, not just to the German people, but to the world at large. How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action? Sophie Skoll, 1943. For the next part, I would like to invite the Education Director at the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, Kristopher Clancy, to give a testimony on his family's resistance.
As we've heard, resistance to the Nazis came in many forms, whether it was giving food to those in need, hiding a child, or taking up arms to stop the onslaught of Nazi aggression. When we think of resistance, too often we only conjure up the images of men and women hiding in the forest and fighting back in the black of night. We think of hidden bombs or skulking in the streets in the dark. When I was growing up, this is what resistance was to me. It was this resistance on an individual and a national level. The United States entered the war against the Nazis on December 11, 1941, and immediately began preparations for fighting the Nazis in Europe. On my mother's side, the story of resistance comes at a very high personal cost. My great-grandfather, Philip Kurzer, immigrated to America from the newly founded Ukraine soon after the end of World War I. He arrived in New York with his father, Moshe, and his brother, whose name we have never known. I have the honor to carry the Hebrew name of those two men that took a chance to move to the new country, knowing nothing of the culture, and to wear that name with pride. In Yiddish, we have the saying, "Und man tracht, und Gott lacht." Man plans, and God laughs. The original plan was for Philip, Moshe, and the brother to then bring over his mother and the rest of the siblings. Being an immigrant to a new country is never easy, but being an immigrant to a new country in which one barely speaks the language or understands your culture is even harder. Moshe and my great uncle decided that America was not the place for them and returned to the Ukraine to continue living with the rest of the family there. By that time, my great-grandfather had married and had already had one little boy, my great-uncle, Irving. It would be a fateful decision for them and the rest of the family in 1941. His parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, all those people that he had grown up with, were murdered in 2 days in the worst massacre of World War II, Babi Yar. God certainly wept that day, but not out of humor or mirth. He wept for the destruction of so many innocents, needless death for the sole purpose of continuing hatred and intolerance. While I did not know this until after the war, the reports of the treatment of Jews had made its way into the newspapers of America, and coincidentally New Zealand as well. And he was spurned to join the US Army. You see, the whole time my mother was growing up, she was told her grandfather was just a cab driver. During the war, he just drove the people around. The reality of what he did during the war would not come to light until my own parents went to get married. See, my father was a US Marine during the Vietnam War. And when my parents went to get married, they needed special permission from the Marine Corps due to the fact that my father had a high security clearance level. When they investigated my mother and her family, that's when we learned the truth of what my great-grandfather actually did during the war. An incredibly intelligent man, he spoke English, Russian, Yiddish, and German. These language skills would become invaluable as he was much more than a simple cab driver. My father tells me when he was called into the office of the Commandant of the Marine Corps he was informed that my great-grandfather had never been fully decommissioned. He was considered to still be an active spy as part of the CIA. His resistance and ultimate revenge against the Nazis was to use his language skills to gather information and give it to the US Army. I never got a chance to meet him as he passed away before I was born, but we share a love of languages, commitment to eradicating antisemitism, and to honoring our family. My dad's mother, Hazel Bradford, was one of millions of women who joined the war effort against the Nazis. A young woman, she worked with the United States Air Force in air traffic control. I remember growing up and going to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and my father pointing to the planes in the ceiling and saying, "See that one? Your grandmother helped design that. Her name's on it." He'd take me up there, past where general visitors are supposed to go, just to see her name. The amount of trouble that we got in, it's unbelievable. I'm banned from the Smithsonian. But that's for another story. You see, my grandmother is from proud people who are the epitome of resistance. In my mihi, you may have heard a word that did not match any of the other te reo. I come from two iwi, or two tribes. Hurai, the te reo word for Jew, and Dine. In English, the word Dine means the people, and it is what the members of the Navajo Nation call themselves. My grandmother is from a tribe without whom the American effort in World War II would have looked vastly different. The Nazis created the Enigma machine to encode their messages and hide their missives from the Allies. Once cracked, though, they were never able to create a new code. The Allies had something better than a machine to pass coded messages. They had the code talkers. These men, from many different First Nations peoples, used their native languages to transmit messages in the European and Pacific theaters. My grandmother's siblings, cousins, and extended family fought in the war, using their bilingualism as a means to resist the Nazis and the Axis. So, how does two people, both fighting with the American military, equate to resistance? If we take a step back and look at resistance to the Nazis as a whole, we see that it wasn't just a single act of resistance or a single group, but the combined efforts of millions that eventually led to the downfall of Nazi Germany. Resistance inside ghettos, in camps, cities, and villages, from major armies to ragtag bands of farmers turned fighters. They all resisted the Nazis in their own way. Each act of resistance was a spark that lit the next act until a raging firestorm ignited in a conflagration that brought an end to the Holocaust and the reign of terror that the Nazis had brought to the world. Kia ora. El Mare Rachamim, God full of compassion, is a prayer for the departed, used at funerals, visiting grave sites, and on memorial days such as today. A plea for the deceased to be granted menucha nechona, proper rest. The worshiper says that they will contribute to charity in the remembrance of his or her soul. After the Holocaust, a new paragraph was added to the prayer specifically for the victims of the Holocaust. This text continues the plea for menucha nechona for those murdered in the concentration and death camps, erected around Europe by the Nazis and their collaborators. As the video plays, you'll see images of life before war, progressing through the stages of Nazi persecution. Please rise for El Mare Rachamim.
Hey Auschwitz, Majdanek, Eblinka, Uveshar Machnas Hashemaz, B'Europa, Shenehergu v'shenisrefu, B'chol misois meshinois, v'yachzuriois. שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם, אחים ויחוסיהם, נוברים צדוקו ביד הסקורס נשמעו עשיהם. רחמים יסיום ססקנופו ליואלומים ויתרוי רחיים אסנישמותו
יתגדל ויתקדש שמה רבה, בעלמה דברק רעותה, וימליך מלכותה, ויצמח פורקנה, ויקרב משיחה, בחייכם וביומכם, ובחיי כל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. אמן. יהיה שמה רבה מבורך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמע בקודשך ברוך הוא. לעלה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיי טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. אמן.
On behalf of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, I would like to thank you for coming to this evening's commemoration. Each year, we gather to honor the lives lived and lost to the Nazis and their collaborators, ensuring that their deaths were not in vain and that their memories live on. In October last year, I spoke at the opening of the Children's Holocaust Memorial at the Waitangi Treaty Grounds. In that speech, I spoke on how those who entered the memorial space, those present and watching the opening event, had become the embodiment of living memory, with the responsibility to continue to speak about the individual victims of the Holocaust. This year, with the theme of being resistance to the Holocaust, each one of you has taken up upon your shoulders of being a resistor. Where you see resistance to the Holocaust did not end in 1945 with the capitulation of the Nazis. The most insidious part of genocide is that long after the killings and deportations have ended, there are always those who will question the validity of events. We know that there is a marked increase in threats against Jewish communities around the world, including right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Dangerous comparisons of health measures to the Nazis and the horrors visited upon victims downplay the realities of the events of the Holocaust. Flat-out denial has morphed into an even more insidious and dangerous beast, becoming Holocaust distortion. Using facts of the Holocaust to further political goals or changing the number of victims are prime examples of Holocaust distortion. Each one of us has a responsibility to take up the mantle of those that came before us and resist the tides that would alter or deny the events of the Holocaust. In Hebrew, we say, Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze B'Zeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another. We have the responsibility to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust, the lives of those lost, are remembered and not used for political points. Commemoration without action rings hollow. I say this at every event that I am a part of. It is to each of us that we guarantee action continues and that the Holocaust is not lost to the annals of history, one of many volumes of events that is given only cursory glances in a high school curriculum. For myself, the board of HCNZ, and the members of the wider community, I would like to thank all of you for coming and honoring all the lives of those touched by the Holocaust. As you go forth, my hope is that you take the message with you into your daily lives and remember the words of Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel. For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Ngā mihi nui, tō tālaba,